Greetings, everyone. My name is Adil Najam. I am the Dean of the Pardee School of Global Studies here at Boston University, and it is my great pleasure to welcome all of you and our guests on behalf of the Pardee Center for the study of the longer range future, to the first of a new series of events that we are launching, which we call the Future Of. And in this series, what we want to do is to look at the great at the future trajectories of some of the biggest questions that are before us. To look at where big issues are going, to think bold, to think big, to think about the future in a systematic way, not by way of predicting what it might be, but certainly by way of thinking what we need to do today to prepare for the great challenges that are upon us already and are likely to become bigger in the future. And for today's first of this series, we are going to begin with probably the most obvious of those great challenges of our times, the challenge of global climate change. And I have with me today a panel about as good as I can imagine collecting on this topic anywhere. I have with me Dr. Saleemul Haq. Saleemul Haq wears many, many hats, including being the director of the International Center for Climate Change and Development, the ICCC-AD in Bangladesh, in Dhaka. But he's really also one of the people who has probably worked more and done more to bring the idea of the importance of adaptation, particularly for the most vulnerable countries, into the global discussion, including into the IPCC, into the UNFCCC process. I have with me from Bamako in Africa, Dr. Youba Sokona. Youba is a veteran of international climate policy and is currently the chair of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC. I'm also joined by Professor Lucy Hutyra, who is an associate professor of Earth and Environment here at Boston University, and my colleague, Professor Henrik Selin, who is with me at the Pardee School of Global Studies, and also the author of a very recent book on called Mercury Stories. So with this eminent panel, I would welcome you all. I would ask all of you as you listen to us speak, please throw in your questions, put them in the comments. We will be looking at that and very happy to engage with that as we go along. But let me start with this biggest question that we have for today. And let me start with Dr. Saleemul Haq. What do you see, having worked so long on climate change issues, what do you see as the greatest of issues, the greatest of your hopes or fears when you think about global climate change and its future?
Thank you very much, Adil, and thanks for inviting me to this discussion. As you've pointed out, I've been in this game now for quite a long time. I've been to every single of the 25 conferences of parties of the UNFCCC that have been held so far. So
my condolences.
Indeed, a veteran of the process. So, by all rights, I should be extremely pessimistic because we have not done much or enough, nowhere near enough during that time. But I am personally an eternal optimist. And so I am looking at the future with some sense of optimism. The recent election in the United States is a very good sign in the right direction. In fact, I would even count the COVID-19 pandemic as in one way a sign that has shown the whole world how broken the system is and that we don't need to be going back to the business as usual anymore. We need to go to a forward-looking new a paradigm of development, a new paradigm of energy use, a new paradigm of economics, and in particular, a focus on the most vulnerable communities and people around the world. As you pointed out, that has been my focus of work. So my sense of optimism in the future comes from two words, in my view. The first word is science. We need to be focusing on the science. I think the COVID-19 message is is very plain to see. Every single leader in the world had to make a decision based on what their scientists were telling them. The leaders who took the initiatives based on the science were able to restrict the virus and protect their citizens. Leaders who ignored the scientists and ignored the science have ended up killing their own citizens. And in the United States, you are now crossing 500,000 people who have died because your leaders refuse to listen to the science. It's nothing more stark than that in terms of the science, the listening to the science from our leaders. The second one is something I would focus on, and is what I focus on in my work, is what I call solidarity, global solidarity, particularly among citizens, amongst young people. I have great faith in young people, in both in the United States and in the rest of the world, because the older generation have failed us. I see the younger generation as the ones with the energy and the willingness to challenge orthodoxy, to challenge the existing paradigms, and to challenge their own parents in terms of what the parents have done or not done, and to change that. And being a university professor, I'm surrounded by young, energetic young people, boys and girls, who give me the greatest amount of faith. And I am now enjoying working with that next generation, given up on my generation, as it were. So that's where I have my faith now, Adil.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I wanted later to pick up on the science question because there are two science questions. For a long time, the science question was we need more science. And there's a science question of we need to listen to the science we have, which there is also a lot of. But I want to just park that question before I move to Professor Selin to see what do you see when you look at the future as what is the most important thing we should be thinking about?
So thank you very much, Adil. Thank you for bringing everyone together. I'm very happy to be on this panel with colleagues from all over the world. So I would say that my greatest hope is that the Paris Agreement will succeed, and my greatest fear is that the Paris Agreement will fail. Whether we like it or not, at the global level, the Paris Agreement really is the only game in town. You can complain about the Paris Agreement, you can say that you want a different agreement, but the Paris Agreement is what we have. And the way that is set up, it is then largely hoping that countries will voluntarily take much more ambitious action. And here's my fears. That's what we've been hoping for the last 30 years, and we haven't seen it in the last 30 years. So why would we magically see it happen now? So I do believe that there is a real risk that even the Paris Agreement model will fail. My hope, though, goes off what Saleem said in his opening remarks, is that I also do see things are changing. I think for the last 30 years, we have seen climate change and climate policy as sort of a niche issue. You're doing policy in this area, you're doing policy in that area, and then climate, and then area, and that area, and that area. And then what I think we're starting to see now, finally, is that thinking around climate change mitigation and climate change adaptation is finally starting to get integrated into a broader policy framework of societal development. I have always viewed it that there's no point of having climate policy for the sake of having climate policy. Climate policy is not an end, it's a means to an end, and that end is to advance human well-being. So if we can integrate climate policy more in how we build future society and not seeing it as a niche issue, but as sort of an integral issue of developing the kind of societies we want to live in, then I think that there is great hope for the future.
Thank you. And you, I assume, and because we've worked so much on this together and written on this together, preempted my comments about Paris. I hope your hope turns out to be true. I sometimes do cynically fear that we may declare Paris a success, even if it isn't, because we are so eager for it to succeed. And on that little thought, let me go to Youba and ask him from your vantage point, both of the IPCC, but also having looked so deeply at the most vulnerable countries, particularly those in Africa. When you look at the future of global climate change, what do you see as the big hope, the big fear, the big challenge?
I think, as Selin said, there is a lot of reason to be very, very, very pessimistic. When I start this process, back to 1992, we all thought that we will change completely the world. I did not have at that time any great Actually, I have a lot of gray. And I think that one of the biggest problem is science, and the issue is science, because the science bring clarity on issues, on the complexity of issues. We have a better understanding. Remember, when we started, development issue was not at all an issue in the climate context. I think that we have been instrumental in bringing development and sustainable development in as part of the conversation. Adaptation was not also in the equation, and then we bring it. But currently, I think science is used as a pretext not getting to action. Because if you go back to fourth assessment report, if you want really to get in action, we don't need the fifth assessment report, we don't need the sixth assessment report, we don't need any subsequent report if you really want to get in action. And but we use science to say we don't know, we need to know more. And this is a big problem. And then the hope side is that, because we have not, when the action were easier to take on, back to the early age of the climate, and then to change completely the course of the production, the consumption, we did not look at that. But now it became much more complex and complicated to take action. But the hope came to, and surprising to me, is the youth movement. And then the school kids. Because we try to push one, for me, the fundamental element that does not need a lot of money, a lot of resources. Article 6 of the conventions has been neglected. I did everything to push that in the early days of the climate. What Article 6 of the convention says? Education, information, awareness raising in a continuous basis in order to change our behaviors. Because dealing with climate, there is two critical elements you need to bring together. Technology will bring some responses. This is in the short and the mid-term, but ultimately it's a behavioral change, and that's the long term. And then that cannot be achieved without information, education, and behavioral change. Let me stop from here.
Thank you. Lucy, as I come to you, we are seeing a pattern. They're all putting it on science. And you do science, and you do science both at the global, but also at very local and immediate contexts of cities and so on and so forth. What do you see when you look at the great challenge of global climate change? What do you see as the thing that either gives you the biggest hope or makes you afraid?
My biggest fear is that the goal to reach the goals of Paris Accord is really hard. The amount of emissions changes that we need are mind-boggling. What we've seen with the emissions reductions associated with COVID, which are massively disrupting to everything about our lives, we need to do that level of change every year for the next decade. And it's a daunting task to imagine how we get there. On the other hand, we have the science in many respects. We know how to do green energy. With the technology is there. The challenge that we face in the coming years is actually deploying it and implementing it and figuring out where we put the wind turbines, where we put the solar fields. And that has a lot of trade-offs. And those trade-offs, I think in many of the discussions of things like the Green New Deal, those are not yet being discussed in a way that they need to be. The technology is there, but the implementation is our next hurdle. I also think COVID has identified opportunities for us that we didn't know were there. And I think some of those changes are behavioral changes, our transportation changes, our how we use commercial buildings, how we fly. I think that many of those changes could last in the long term, which gives me some optimism about what's coming. Leading a little bit to one of your next questions about the science, I think one of my biggest uncertainties, fears, looking to the future is, will our carbon sinks last? We currently have an incredible benefit to the planet with the oceans and forests taking up carbon. So not all the emissions stay in the atmosphere. And how stable are those sinks? That's my big fear, is if those sinks destabilize.
You have all set a really wide and important agenda, in some ways a frightening agenda, in another way optimistic. I smile because all of you are willing yourself and all of us to be optimistic, whether out of choice or out of necessity, because in some ways, what other choice do we have? If not optimism, then what do we do? And in that sort of spirit, I also wanted to introduce the idea that we are also joined today. We have about 60, 70 viewers already live with us, and they are putting in some questions. Please do look at them, and we please keep bringing them in. But we're also joined today by one of our partner institutions, the Scotia Group, which is a group of eminent leaders from around the world who have taken on the task of wanting to figure out how to assist the COP process in Glasgow, the next coming conference of the parties, in terms of things that can be done. So let me phrase that as a question as I welcome them here from the Scotia Group. Anyone can take this. So you have this optimism, you have these big challenges. What can be done? What can be done now to look at that future? Bill Gates has his new book out, and he's saying change everything, including, he is saying, bring nuclear back, but you need a societal technological change. But he also holds on to that optimism in technology. But what is it that leaders, you would want them to be doing today to make us move towards that better future? Henrik, can I dump this one on you first, and then anyone can pick it up?
Sure. So I would say that countries, and Saleem has actually much more experience on this. So if he thinks I'm incorrect, he is more than welcome.
Go ahead. I'll challenge you if I think you're wrong.
Is that a lot of countries, or most countries in fact, go to the conference of the parties with fairly set preferences. So if you want to change a country, don't do it at the COP, but do it in between COPs. That's where the lobbying takes place. Trying to change someone's mind during the COP is extremely, extremely difficult. So that's the first thing.
And very late.
And very late, right?
It's too late. Yeah.
So rather than saying, well, it's going to happen at the COP in Glasgow, no, it's going to happen between now and the COP in Glasgow, if anything's going to happen. So that would be the first point. And then the second point, sort of just jump off what Lucy said here about the sort of the magnitude of the challenge, but that we have the technology, right? So that's sort of start deploying the technology that we have. Start thinking about how to use what we have. Those would be my 2 points.
Saleem, you want to jump in as a veteran?
Yeah, sure. Can I? Thank you very much, Henrik. I'll build on that. I agree entirely that it's not at the COP, but before the COP, in order to make the COP a success, if we want it to be a success. And to me, there are three major political elements of optimism here. The first being the election in the US and the new Biden administration re-entering or rejoining the Paris Agreement, appointing John Kerry, who was the architect of the Paris Agreement, as his climate envoy, putting in place significant climate change related national policies at the national level, in re-engaging with the global, organizing a big event on 22nd April in the US in preparation for the COP. These are all good signs, particularly compared to the last 4 years of retrogressive actions from the United States and your previous president. At the same time, the COP presidency under Prime Minister Boris Johnson in the UK, I think also sees this as an opportunity for COP26 to be a very, very significant game-changing COP if everything can be put in place to make that happen. The third political stream I would like to focus on is the one that I've been associated with for many years, is the voice and role of the vulnerable countries. And in that context, there is a group of vulnerable countries which are not necessarily negotiating or a negotiating group, but a more politically developed group of leaders. It's called the Climate Vulnerable Forum. It's about 50 of the poorest countries in the world, set up about 10 years ago under President Nasheed of the Maldives at that time. And since then, it has been a leadership forum. It was very active in Paris. In fact, they were the ones who pushed for the 1.5 degree global temperature goal on behalf of all the vulnerable countries. That forum is currently chaired by my Prime Minister, Sheikh Hasina, Prime Minister of Bangladesh, who will be the chair for the next 2 years, including COP26. And she is very, very proactive. She's very knowledgeable about this issue. And Bangladesh is taking an extremely proactive position in trying to harness the vulnerable countries to get maximum action from all countries to reduce their emissions. In the climate change jargon, it's raising ambition to improve their nationally determined contributions, but at the same time to look at impacts of climate change in the poor countries and help the poorer countries adapt to the impacts of climate change. And now, unfortunately, we have gone beyond adaptation, and there's a new thing called loss and damage, which is happening already with climate change, which is attributable to human-induced climate change happening, that will have to be dealt with, even though this is a politically sensitive issue in the negotiations that the developed countries like the US and UK don't want to talk about, but they're going to have to talk about it, even if they don't want to.
Can I come in because there is one question related to institutional aspect, the governance aspect related to institutional. I think that one of the biggest problem is that it's on the negotiations, the negotiation process. It's become a kind of hybrid. It goes beyond the negotiation. It is not on implementation, because his mandate is not implementation. We have the scientific body, that is IPCC. It is not an organization. It's very cheap. The entire budget of IPCC is $5 million per year. This is nothing, this is a peanut, but it's very efficient. It works, it can adapt. But we do not have any mechanism at global level for the implementation. And then the COP is not implementation body, is for negotiations, where we discuss implementation. The implementation is not at the global level, it's a national level, at local level. Imagine today, Mali wanted to have a climate compatible development program where it will get support. It is not the UNFCCC. Even if they have billions, and then how they will implement that. This is a big problem, and then no one is facing it.
So let me exactly come to this, because this is a really key point, and it responds to the question that John had asked about global governance. Is that the problem? Is science the problem? Or, as Youba has inserted here, is implementation the issue? Lucy, if I come to you, in some ways, implementation has to be local. Mm-hmm. Right? It has to be in my city, in my village, on my coastline, on the buildings I built. But does that also not sometimes threaten the very idea Youba is pointing out about the global responsibility, or what Selin is talking about loss and damage somewhere else? So I will focus on making Boston University, our buildings, as good as possible, helps with mitigation, but does it also not distract, or could it also not distract from that global responsibility of understanding that this won't happen except globally? Any thoughts on that, Lucy?
I completely agree. There should be a global coordination in the implementation, but there's not. On the other hand, things have happened locally anyway. Much of my work has focused on cities and greenhouse gas emissions and mitigation that's happening in cities. And cities are a horrible scale and unit for each of these cities to be individually figuring out how to do it and what to do and where are their emissions. On the other hand, it's currently a poorly coordinated effort, but there's a political will where many of the cities want to do it. And if they want to, and their constituents are willing to support it, cities in the United States under an administration that was anti-climate action, cities were fantastically successful in implementing change. So it's not the best way to do it. On the other hand, there's action happening.
Can I pick on that for you first and then anyone else? You said cities are a horrible scale. Explain why they are horrible. And also the fear I sometimes have, when we say cities have done something, we usually mean some cities have done some things.
Yes.
Right. And then that means in a world, there are many others who haven't. And how does that add up?
So cities are an important place to look because it's where most of the emissions, the actual greenhouse gas emissions are happening. So the emissions are concentrated. So if the actions are also concentrated in the places where the emissions are, you can have an efficient action. But cities are governed individually, and they're uncoordinated, and they're often a low level of government where they don't have jurisdiction over many of the things that can actually determine their emissions. So things like, I'll take Boston, for example, many of our roads, the city has zero authority because they're state roads or they're federal roads. And so they can't implement changes. The city can't implement changes to the state's grid. The state has to do that. On the other hand, the city does have power around building regulations, around efficiency standards. It has some power. And cities, many cities around the world have yielded that power to start to change what their emissions profiles look like. Cities also compete with one another to be green, to be viewed as progressive and leaders in this. And they're copying each other in a wonderful way, where some of the things that are working in cities are getting replicated. But it's the governance of cities is very individual. It's uncoordinated.
Henrik, maybe for you, but anyone can jump.
I can come in because the problem is that, Lucy, maybe we are not in the same planet. Because for me, cities are the problem. Cities create a lot of problem because depending on the reality I'm living, cities in Africa is a source of cutting down the forest because the main source of energy, household energy, is firewood and charcoal. Actually, the charcoal from Bamako is coming, in Mali, is coming from 400 and 600 kilometers away because there is no forest around. They cut everything. City is a problem, horrible problem, because they are building everywhere in concrete, in cement. To build cement factories, you need air conditioning. Cities are horrible because it's attracting all the people from all over the rural areas, creating a nightmare. Because we have to make, it depends. This is one element we really need to look at carefully and seriously. And then the downside of that is everybody is talking actually about energy transition, greening economy, so on and so forth. I just look at the statistic in Africa. The electricity production in Africa, 80% is coming from fossil. It's only 3% coming from non-electric renewable. And if you look at different projects in the pipeline of implementation in Africa, for the coming 10 years, for electricity production, all are fossil. That means they will implement them, they will create a lock-in system that's related to urbanization process. So we have to be very careful.
I completely agree about lock-in of energy infrastructure, and I think there's huge differences between cities across the globe, but cities also, especially in Europe, in parts of Asia, in North America, there are efficiencies that come with the scale and the concentration of people. And many of those efficiencies are what can be exploited to reduce the per capita emissions.
So, Henrik, let me come to you. I mean, we are now confronted in this conversation with the logic of global, that in our desperation to want good stories, we can sometimes be cherry picking the good stuff that is happening in some places because we hope that will then be replicated. But the scale is global, and without that global, without the Paris Agreement succeeding, there is this island effect that can happen. What is your view on the importance of global versus just sort of, let's do this at more local scales, and that will itself somehow transform into global action because people will do this themselves in various places?
Right. So this is sort of a perennial problem. What do you do locally? What do you do regionally? And what do you do globally? Right. And I do think that there is definitely a role to be played at the global level. That's where you need to set up the institutional framework. That's where you need to have the discussions, and you need to bring all countries together, because climate change looks very different from a European perspective, from a North American perspective, from an African perspective, from the perspective of small island states or Southeast Asia. And all of them should have a seat at the table, and all of them should be able to voice their interests and their concerns. One thing, though, that I would sort of push back a little bit about is sort of, yes, we need to have global governance. But if we are to significantly reduce annual greenhouse gas emissions, we are talking about the European Union, China, United States, India, throw in a couple of other countries. As in, it's a relatively small number of all of those 193 UN members that produce the vast majority of greenhouse gas emissions. So you don't really need 193 countries to take very stringent actions here. You need a smaller number of them to start leading. So that's why cooperation has to be global, but implementation has to be regional, national, or even local.
And another reminder that it has to be all, and it has to be balanced, and it's not going to be easy. Saleem, I want to come to you. But let me also throw a question at the 1.5, which is very, very important for the most vulnerable countries. I will ask you first, and then I'll ask everyone to say, I mean, between you, I calculate there's at least 100 years of experience on climate work on this screen. And there is even more passion. What is your best bet? Is there any chance at all that we will be able to meet the 1.5 degree goal? But I will throw that question, but take it wherever you want.
Sure. Thank you very much, Adil. I'll start with that, and then I'll reflect a little bit on the other questions, particularly the local to global dichotomy that you framed. So on the 1.5 degrees, as I mentioned earlier, this has been something that the vulnerable countries very much argued for, advocated for, and succeeded in getting into the Paris Agreement 5 years ago in COP15 in Paris, in COP21 in 2015 in Paris. And increasingly, it looks like it might be unachievable. My own view is that it is still achievable if we have the political will to make it happen. The technology exists, the finance exists, as Lucy said. The political will is still missing. And we need to be working on that as much as possible. And in particular, with the new administration in the US, working with China, the two biggest emitters, and then a handful of other big emitters, as Henrik quite rightly points out, if we can get them moving in the right direction, which they are doing now, by the way, and bring them the global temperature, if you add up all the nationally determined contribution promises that are being made so far, are taking us towards 2 degrees, and I haven't reached 2 degrees yet, but they're moving towards it and hopefully below it, and can reach 1.5 degrees. So we may or may not need the sort of big geoengineering solutions that the Bill Gates of this world are now trying to promote and suggest that because we can't do it by normal means, we're going to have to do these abnormal geoengineering type solutions. I myself am not really sure that we need to give up at this point in time. However, let me also mention on the local to global connecting issue. And I mentioned, I bring back my earlier glue that I would suggest is solidarity particularly between the vulnerable communities in different parts of the world. And, you know, if you look at even in the United States of America right now, you look at what happened in Texas just a few days ago with the cold wave. Who are the ones who suffered the most? It's the poor, vulnerable people, the people of color, people, immigrants, in living in the cities, in the slums of the towns and cities. That's one of the things that unites cities across the world. Poor people living in the slums of cities are the ones who are hardest hit, incidentally, by COVID-19 and the lockdown measures, and then now also by climate change. So there is a potential for a sense of solidarity to be brought across, a bottom-up sense of solidarity, which is what I work on, you know, locally led adaptation across the world. And I recently ran a 7-day-long conference called Gobeshona, which is Bangla for research, where we had sessions from all over the country, all over the world, including from the United States of America, of people doing local level adaptation, but then connecting across continents, across countries to find synergies, possibilities of learning from each other, possibilities of linking up in solidarity. And the best example that I can cite, which Youba has cited already, is the school children every Friday going out of school, led by the example of Greta Thunberg, which has connected school kids all over the world. This is really a phenomenon that is taking place. Now, if we can harness that energy and bring it forth to make the politicians change, that's what we need. You know, the politicians are the ones who are not changing.
It is clearly a phenomena, and both the passion and the anger, but it's also an abdication on our generation's part in some ways, because what the young people are saying is, you guys failed. So Youba, listening to those young people, what would you say to those who will gather in Glasgow at the next
I think that those who will be gathering in Glasgow, and I will tell them just to pick the fundamental, one of the key messages that came out to the IPCC 1.5 report. And this is rapid, far-reaching, profound transformation on all aspects of the society, because incremental aspect and then piecemeal approach will not solve the problem. And this one element. And then in order to do so, Salim indicated will. I will go beyond the will. Will is only one part of it. The political will is important because we attract the attention of all the head of the state in Paris. Beyond the will, we need institutions, because the current institutions are not designed to tackle the problem we are facing, because they are in silos. Particularly. And then the second element is related to resources. Resources is not only finance. We have the tendency to only focus on finance. It's human resources, the way we think, the interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary aspect. And then the third element is fundamental. And this is linking the short-term and the long-term imperative at the same time. And then if we need those different aspects.
Allow me
just to one point on the solidarity Salim is not working. COVID have demonstrated even within the Europe, each country are looking at their own country, and there is no possibility for the African to get to be expected to be vaccinated within the next coming 3 years. Sorry,
I'm glad you made that solidarity point. I do want to push one question at you, but also come to the other. So very quickly, I hear you that fundamental transformation. You say that, IPCC says that, Bill Gates says that. But we have in our viewers someone, Naina Tobin, I hope I'm saying her first name right. But what she says is, tell me the trade-offs. And especially in a post-COVID world with the economic pressures, with the political pressures, how do you do that? How do you do fundamental transformation in a world that is still full of poor people struggling to survive, and climate is seen still as a trade-off issue rather than an issue that makes people's lives better?
The problem is that we approach the issue at the global level. This is what Bill Gates indicated. He never talked about behavioral change. I was part of the conversation he organized, and I raised the issue of technological-driven solutions, not behavioral change. The thing is, if we discuss the findings at the local and national level, we found the solution is adapted to the local context rather than at the global level. The global level will be only, rhetorics. Nothing will work, and then they will take buzzwords. they will say energy transition, they will say carbon-based solution, they will say everything everyone agrees with. It will not work at all. And then action solutions are at the local level, at the cities level, at the national level, not at the global level.
Henrik, briefly, what would you say to those who will gather at Glasgow? What is the one thing you would want to see out of it?
One thing that I would like to see, and I'm not unique in this case, of course, is to sort of significantly increased ambitions. And I'm particularly interested to see what the United States will do, what the Biden administration is able to do, because there's no question that President Biden and John Kerry and Gina McCarthy and the others take this issue very, very seriously. But we also know how dysfunctional the US political system is at the moment. So just the White House wanting something doesn't necessarily translate into federal policy or all states moving in the right direction. So it will be very interesting to see what the United States is actually bringing to the table. But then it will also be interesting to see if there are significant movement in other countries' positions. But I would also like to see more information about the scale up of renewable energy or no carbon energy sources, because that is moving very, very well, relatively very rapidly at the moment. So it will be interesting to see countries reporting more, or the International Energy Agency and others reporting on what is going on with the scale up of renewable electricity and energy.
Lucy, Henrik wants more ambition. What do you want from the US, whether at Glasgow or within the US? What would you want to see that will give you the feeling that the hopes we are talking about, we are actually moving towards that? What would you want to see from the US?
So from the US, I want so much. I want so much that we haven't been getting in recent years. And I'm probably pretty pessimistic that the just based on emissions reductions that we can reach the Paris goals. And I think the US and other international leaders need to invest more on negative emissions and some of the geoengineering. I don't want to use those solutions, but we haven't done enough research on what those would look like and how those might be implemented. And right now, the daunting goal of the emissions reductions alone is a very big reach for us to achieve. And if, going back to an earlier comment, if our carbon sinks fail us, if the rate of ocean and forest uptake slows down, then the emissions, then we need even more. And I want an insurance policy that I hope we will never use, but I want more work to happen on understanding the trade-offs and the possibilities on the geoengineering and on negative emissions.
And that itself could be a very controversial issue for some, but it goes back to this thing. I want to believe, Selin, that 1.5 is possible, but in some ways I want to get you guys on tape, because I don't think the math can work. Mm-hmm. I want it to. I desperately want it to. I'll give you for that to happen, but I just don't see how the math works, and that is going to leave the most vulnerable countries in a lurch because we never tried. Saleem, I give you the phone to Mr. Kerry on behalf of the vulnerable countries of the world. You have 2 minutes. What do you say to Mr. John Kerry?
Well, Mr. Kerry has to realize that the world has changed over the last 4 years from when he was in the Paris Agreement and now re-entering the Paris Agreement. It's become a lot worse in those last 4 years, and mainly because of the United States of America. So the US does not just get credibility for rejoining, and while we welcome it, we're not going to applaud them until they actually demonstrate that they're going to do something very serious, both domestically in terms of their own emission reductions, very, very seriously, but also globally in terms of supporting the rest of the world to deal with the, unfortunately now, real impacts of climate change that are taking place all over the world. Climate change is no longer something that's going to happen. It's something that's already happening. People are being affected everywhere, including in the United States of America. And that is now very much part of the equation of what are we going to do to deal with it. And Mr. Kerry and his boss, Mr. Biden, are both going to have to take that very, very seriously. So far, I'm not seeing them do that, by the way. They're saying all the good things, but they haven't been really serious about the impacts of climate change yet.
But before I come to Youba, if I can go back to Henrik for a minute, I look at the screen. We have the world represented here, 4 continents, and while it is easy to bash the US because the US gives us so many reasons to, and it's not just the last 4 years. I mean, remember, Paris was watered down by Mr. Kerry. Copenhagen
Absolutely.
was scuttled by Mr. Obama because the national will wasn't there. It wasn't in
Correct.
Congress and it wasn't in the voter. But I want to get away from, it's not as simple as the US. Other major players, including in Europe, will also have to do things that they are not doing. If you have the phone, Henrik, to any leader in the in Europe, who would you call and what would you say?
Well, that's the first question, right? If you want to talk to Europe, who do you call? So right now, climate change is really very much a centralized issue through the European Union. So this would actually be one of those times where it would be appropriate to call someone in Brussels. There are at least 3 or 4 different people one could call, but call someone in Brussels. I would say that the problem on the EU side is not so much ambition as it is on the implementation side. The European, compared to other industrialized countries, the European Union have, to a higher degree, said the right things. And they have also met the initial goals of a 20% reduction below 1990 levels. They do not have the policies in place to reach any more ambitious goals of 30% reductions and 40% reductions and 50 and beyond. So that would be definitely one thing to sort of ask, okay, what are you actually going to do in order to meet those more ambitious goals and do it as quickly as possible? And Europe is also very much at the beginning of figuring out adaptation. It's not like the wealthier countries have figured out adaptation and the developing countries are struggling with adaptation. Everyone is struggling with adaptation. As was mentioned earlier, Europe is definitely also, the European Union also part of those that do not want to talk about loss and damage. So for all of their rhetoric of saving the world, that's one step that they don't want to take. And one could sort of say, well, okay, aren't you just being a tad sanctimonious here? Like, sort of how do you get all of this to fit together?
I want to ask Youba. Youba, if you have the phone, you can call anyone in the world. Who would you call and what would you say? But before you answer, let me throw my answer. If I had that, I would call China. I wouldn't call the US. I wouldn't call Europe. I would first of all call China. I would say thank you for the things you are doing, because in fact, they are somewhat bending the curve, but you aren't doing enough. And the most important thing you can do is to focus on adaptation in the Belt and Road Initiative, because that can have massive impacts in the long term at a global level. That would be my candidate. Youba, who would be yours? And what would you say?
I will call the Pope. I will call the Pope. And I think that the problem, it is not China doing more or the US doing more or the European Union doing more, because the equation have changed completely. It's a matter of system leadership role. That means I can lead and I am able to stimulate other leaders and then to join the movement because it's a collective effort. This is not a piecemeal approach. We have seen, CDM, joint implementation, loss and damage, so on and so forth. All are piecemeal approach. We need a broader aspect and then to put solidarity in the center collectively and then to deal that. It's not one off or two off, is a permanent basis. Only a system leadership can help us. and then to also avoid number of misperception giving to the people that geoengineering will solve the problem. It cannot work without deep mitigation, if it works at all. This very important element is not a substitute of mitigation. We need to change our behavior, we need to change our perspective, and that will only come through a system leadership.
Lucy, do you want to use your call, and especially on the sinks question that you rightly point out, that it's not just an emission question, it's a sinks question. It's an adaptation question, it's multiple questions, but do you want to use that lifeline?
Sure. So I have to reply first on the geoengineering, and I am not an advocate of geoengineering our climate. I think it's a horrible solution. This is not what we want to be doing, but I don't think we've done enough research on it. And if we're decades behind on, carbon capture, storage, on all of these things. I think more work has to happen to figure out where, how it might be possible and be most effective. But I did want to answer a different question that's come up a couple of times about the sinks, and specifically about the restorative ecosystem management as an insurance policy. It's not enough of an insurance policy. It's great. I've devoted most of my career to studying forests and carbon exchange in forests. It's not enough. Step one is we need to reduce deforestation. We need to change our management practices around oil palm, around agriculture. And maybe first, if we can tackle that, we can think about the planting a gazillion trees as a solution. But the planting trees as an insurance policy has trade-offs. Where will the land come from? How is that land currently being used? Is there water available to support trees there? Why are there not trees already there? Are the soils degraded? Is the climate not suitable? I find it very frustrating to hear, let's plant 1 million trees, let's plant 12 million trees, and that will solve our problem. It's a distraction. People like trees. I love trees. And we have a massive forest carbon sink, which is saving us now. We need to keep that in place, but it's not enough.
As we run out of time, I was hoping to do a round asking you, in 10 years, Paris tenure ends, would we have solved the problem by then? But I don't want to ask that, because I do want to end on a higher note. So here is what I'm going to say. So Paris said $100 billion is needed. And we all thought, what a ridiculously big number. And then came the pandemic. And in 2 days, in one country, we dreamt up $1 trillion, and 6 days we spent it. Mm-hmm. And we suddenly discovered how easy it can be to find $1 trillion when you really want to. So Professor Henrik Selin, I hereby give you $1 trillion. How do you spend it on global climate change?
Well, I was going to say, if you give me that kind of money, I would first buy my friends a drink. But I would spend it, I would say, just shooting from the hip here, I would say 60% mitigation and 40% adaptation.
And within that, you want to open up sort of, is there a particular technology you like for mitigation, or a particular area for adaptation? I know I'm putting you on a spot, but we all spend $1 trillion every week, don't we?
Sure. So I think that one thing that's important with mitigation and technology, when Lucy and I says we have the technology, and that's correct, that it's going to be a plethora of technologies. It's going to be wind, it's going to be solar, it's going to be lots of them. So it's not like, oh yeah, put it all to wind or put it all to solar. And you have to sort of do more research and investment into batteries and battery technology and technology. So it really is sort of a portfolio approach that I would do. And same with adaptation. Selin can speak much more to that than I can do, but that's a sort of a thousand approach, doing 1,000 things at the same time, right? So it's really about the broad portfolio.
I'll come to Saleem at the end. Youba, I am going to transfer you $1 trillion in Bamako to save the world. How do you spend it?
Okay, I will buy Google, Twitter, WhatsApp. No, seriously, I'm not joking.
You won't be able to afford all of them in just $1 trillion.
No, if I buy all of them, I will start impressive communication, information, awareness raising, education program. Because this is the only way out, but it will take generations. And then we need to start. And then COVID, one of the success of COVID, if there is any success, if it changed our behavior. Why I moved from Switzerland to Bamako, and then for the past, almost 1 year, I used to be in a plane a minimum of 3 times a month. For the entire year, I take the plane only 1 time, and I have been very efficient. So that behavioral change can be possible in a very short time, provided that.
This is a really important point, the issue of behavior and the issue of the consumer. In some ways, when we focus on states or then on companies, we forget just how much agency we have as just buyers of things that just get delivered in boxes every day to my house. And you multiply a little action by 100 million people or 7 billion or 8 billion. And exactly. You start seeing real impacts, and that's what Youba is getting to. But Lucy, I don't want to leave you without giving you a little gift of $1 trillion. What do you do?
I'm with Henrik on the adaptation mitigation, but I'm going to add science, and we need to keep funding the science, and that's self-serving.
You're asking for a research grant,
but I don't think that we have been doing enough around, like I said, around the geoengineering, but also around the monitoring and understanding which policies are actually working. And that was one of the big challenges in COVID.
But let me push you. I know I'm running against time, but I do want to. What science? What is the type of science you would? Is it science to find out whether it's happening?
No, not. We know it's happening. It's science to understand how it's evolving and what we can do about it. So it's science around that's related to the mitigation, that's related to the adaptation, that's related to the implementation, to understand what if we implement those solar farms, we're trading land. That land was in a different use. What happens with a massive scale deployment of solar to the ecosystems?
And Bill Gates, who actually does have some of that type of money, is doing that with sort of, trying to find different ways to make cement and so on and so forth. Saleem, $1 trillion, the whole world's future.
So my $1 trillion is to give, what is it, $1,000 per young person to a billion young people everywhere in the world, and give them the money to travel to another country and spend a year in another country, become truly planetary citizens. Because one of the biggest problems I feel is that we tend to think of ourselves as national citizens first, and in a global problem like the pandemic or like global climate change, it's very difficult for us to put on a global citizen hat and empathize with the rest of the world, with other people in other countries. And if we can do that for young people, let them travel. In fact, I invite Americans to come to Bangladesh and see what we are doing to tackle climate change. We're not the vulnerable country that they think of us. We are actually one of the most resilient and most adaptive countries to the impacts of climate change. And that's something that we should be learning from each other on how to tackle these issues and work together as a global citizen tackling a global problem.
I want to thank you, because sort of you really need to think about what to do, how to turn the ship. But lightning round, literally, I need a sentence. We invite you at the Pardee Center in 10 years. Same panel. You come back in 10 years. Will we be talking about all the great things that happened between now and 10 years from now? Or will we be again sort of wanting to find hope in the necessity of being hopeful? This time I'll start with you, Selin. What do you think? We have you on tape, so be careful.
I remain hopeful. Realistically, I should be a pessimist, but I remain optimistic. And I think that we will be able to achieve a lot more than we think we can in 10
Lucy,
years?
next 10 years.
I think we're going to be dealing with the fallout of surprises. There are a lot of surprises that we're not prepared for. The pandemic was one, and hopefully there will be innovations that come with those surprises.
No, but I'm going to push you. Does the Pardee Center prepare for a wake, or does the Pardee Center prepare for a party? 10 years.
I want to say party so bad.
Youba. 10 years.
Education, information, awareness raising.
No, but will we be celebrating the next 10 years, or will we be counting 10 more years that we wish we had done more in?
Unless we deal with education, information, and awareness, we'll be saying exactly the same thing as we said 10 years back.
Henrik, last word.
In the next 10 years, we will be saying exactly what science. And then we can do it, we need more science. But
Henrik.
So in some cultures, the wake is a party to celebrate the life of the person. So there's not necessarily a contradiction between a party and a wake. And I think that that's exactly what we would have. There would be things to celebrate and there would be things to mourn.
Thank you all. This has been a wide-ranging, as we knew, conversation, but it has been an extremely insightful one. I am grateful to all the people who came. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of the questions, but many of them my guests brought in. I thank our guests. I thank all of you, and I thank you for your hope and your enthusiasm. And on that happy note, I agree with you. And maybe I'll end with this. I agree with you. We have the knowledge. We have the ability, I think we even have the money to lick this problem. My only question is whether we as a species have the wisdom to be able to do so and to be able to do so in time. I hope we do. Thank you, everyone. Keep doing what you're doing, and let us all wish for a better world tomorrow.
okay, thank